Spider-Man No Way Home is around the corner, and I decided to rewatch all the Spider-Man films before it, and my opinions have changed on these films. Now, I was never one of the people who thought that the Raimi films were masterpieces, or even the best superhero movies ever made. I mean, that's a pretty loaded claim with films like Iron Man and The Dark Knight existing, but we're not here to discuss such a subjective topic. When I was a kid, if you were to ask me what my favorite film of the Raimi trilogy was, I would say Spider-Man 3. If you asked me that same question a few years ago, I would say Spider-Man 2. But after my recent binge of the series, these are not opinions I can honestly have now. In fact, I can't even say that Spider-Man 2 is the best film in the trilogy. For me, personally, the best film in the Raimi trilogy is the original Spider-Man. So before you get your pitchforks and your torches, just hear me out. So let's get into the topic at hand. And also, this is just an opinion. What I'm saying here is not facts. I know Spider-Man 2 is a beloved film, and I'm not gonna tear it apart, because that's not what this channel is about. And honestly, this movie is still solid. There's nothing to rip apart here. There's no nitpicks in this video towards this film. And even if there were, I'd have to levy that against the entire series. I'll mainly be comparing Spider-Man 1 and 2, and I'll discuss what they both get right and where I think Spider-Man 2 falls flat. Now, I'm not going to critique CGI, comic book accuracy, or any of the cheese in these movies, because it wouldn't be fair. Spider-Man 2 would take a big hit in terms of comic accuracy, with Doc Ock in general, and the Spider-Man No More storyline, and 3 would suffer the same fate with his portrayal of Venom, and overall the whole trilogy would take a hit with how poorly Mary Jane and Harry Osborn's characters are handled. So, I'm gonna leave that out of the equation, because comic book accuracy wasn't really a factor in my enjoyment, or rather disenjoyment, of these films. So, I'll get into what I like about Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 2 is by no means a bad movie, or a bad Spider-Man movie, whatever that means, but it just lacks what Spider-Man 1 had. And don't get me wrong, it has amazing heights, like the train scene, everything with Aunt May and Peter, and the fights with Doc Ock, the amazing hospital scene. I understand why this movie is beloved by many. I'm not gonna sit here and dispute that or pretend like I can't see that coming. It makes sense that Maguire had back pain because he carried this film. Being the main character, that was obvious, but I felt like him and Rosemary Harris's Aunt May were the most fleshed out characters here. However, that being said, its lows are as strong to me. So, I'll get into what I didn't like about Spider-Man 2. The entire Mary Jane and Peter Parker subplot is one of this movie's biggest flaws, and hell, that criticism can be thrown at the entire trilogy if we're being honest. But I feel like here, it's at its worst. I feel like the time spent developing this subplot could have been put into Peter and Otto's relationship just like it did Peter and Norman. Spider-Man 1's runtime is split between two characters, Spider-Man and the Green Goblin. Their origins, their motivations, their arcs come full circle by the end of the movie. It's like a constant moving game of chess. Something like this could have been implemented in 2 if not for this tiresome will they won't they wishy-washy on again off again thing Peter and MJ have going on here. The first film establishes that MJ is at least suspicious that Peter is Spider-Man before the credits roll. Hell, I'd say the ending of the movie confirms she knows he's Spider-Man. The kiss and then giving the circumstances of Peter's frequent absence, his acrobatics when he fought Flash, and the fact that he's friends with Spider-Man, it couldn't be more obvious. But it feels like Raimi kind of forgets this, because this film kind of rethreads that plotline, and that's not my main issue. It's the fact that Peter cannot and will not live with the consequences of his actions like a man. He chooses not to date MJ in the first film because of his responsibility, but throughout this film he oversteps his territory. Now, this isn't uncommon. Look at the terrible subplot in the comics with him and Betty Brant, but similar to that, it just doesn't work. Begging an engaged woman to be your girlfriend is just a bad look, and MJ enabling him is even worse, and that says a lot about Raimi's characterization of her in these films. Throughout the series, she's constantly portrayed as a cheater. She cheats on Harry in the first film, she cheats on John in this film, but in the first film at least she was tolerable because they were teenagers, but it's not good here. Even when they finally get together at the end of the film, she doesn't look too happy about that. Now, I love Peter and I love MJ in the comics. They're a power couple, but her character is so butchered in this film, and moving forward, it's really frustrating. While I don't think it's that bad in the first movie or the third movie, I think it's pretty terrible here. She is also the most damsel in distress I've ever seen put to screen. For someone who's the most important person in the main character's life, aside from Uncle Ben and maybe Gwen Stacy, Raimi really did her dirty in this film. It's a shame too, because Kristen Dunst is an amazing actress and she does really well with what she's giving. I think the relationship with Spider-Man 3 is handled a lot better here. It does have the same tragic love story angle from Spider-Man 2, but it's executed much better. It feels like Raimi didn't really know what to do with her. So much of this film is devoted to their relationship, and it could have been devoted to Alfred Molina's Dr. Octopus. And that brings me to my second gripe. Alfred Molina is a great actor, but he pales in comparison to William Dafoe's Green Goblin, who had much more screen time, a deeper connection to Maguire's Peter Parker, and was fleshed out amazingly with clear motivations of his character. Norman's driving force for his actions stem from how much the people in his life have constantly let him down and betrayed him in some way, shape, or form. Totally not Mark says it better than I could, so I'll just play a snippet of his video.
Unlike the rest of the world, Norman sees Spider-Man as his kin, someone that, unlike the rest of the world that has betrayed him, he sees himself in, which also goes a long way in explaining why he treats his son like he's nothing and why he shows interest in Peter, because he sees Peter as someone that's exceptional, just like him. In this film, Norman is betrayed by his friend Max and the board members. They are people looking to take advantage of him and what he's built. Therefore, they're not worth consideration. Furthermore, Harry, his son, doesn't demonstrate any exceptional qualities unlike Peter, and therefore, he thinks nothing of him, which his relationship reflects. And finally, even to Norman, Mary Jane is just another one of those unremarkable individuals that uses people for everything they've got before spitting them out. Just like his wife did, just like his friends did. In spite of everything he thinks he's done for them, eventually they've all turned against him.
Dafoe brings the Goblin to life in a way that Molina couldn't for Dr. Octopus. And it's not his fault. It's just the film itself is doing so much that he doesn't have time to shine. It's a shame because Doc Ock is one of Spider-Man's most formidable villains. I think it was a bad idea that Peter and Otto's relationship is just built over a few minutes on screen, and then the next time we see him, he's already a villain. We don't know much about him besides the exposition given. Now don't get me wrong, this exposition is amazing. I just wish we had more time for him to shine as Otto Octavius, so that his fall from grace hits even harder. I wish him and Peter had an actual relationship similar to the one shown in the first film between him and Norman. Insomniac Spider-Man does this brilliantly, and it does take cues from what Sam Raimi built up, so props to Raimi. But I'm not going to compare the two. All I'm saying is something similar could have been implemented here. After all, Peter and Otto share a central theme of loss, failure. Peter loses damn near everything in this film, just like Otto. I feel like this could have been built on. In fact, I feel like this should have been the only thing this film deals with. Some of its subplots, mostly the one with MJ, could have been cut or shortened. But speaking of subplots, there's another that drags this film. James Franco's acting in this film really destroys what is an otherwise interesting subplot. It just doesn't feel like Franco is giving it his all. It feels like his dad dying was a mild inconvenience. I honestly think it was a miscast for Franco in the first place because he wasn't really good in the first film, but he was around much less there. Thankfully, I think his acting soars to really amazing heights in Spider-Man 3. There are a few iffy moments here and there, but these three movies aren't perfect, alone. But when put together, we have an interesting trilogy on our hands. Now, I hope these criticisms of the second film don't turn you off from the rest of the video. By all means, I think Spider-Man 2 is still a great film. It just doesn't do it for me anymore. That award goes to the first film. Sam Raimi's original Spider-Man is a near-perfect film to me. It doesn't have the highs of the second film, but it also doesn't have the lows. Everything is perfectly balanced here, or as perfect as it can from a superhero movie in the early 2000s. The ever-changing narrative between Peter and Norman as both stories come to a head in the middle and leads to one of the best climaxes in the series for me, only rivaled by the brilliant climax of Spider-Man 3. Dafoe brings Green Goblin to life. He's the perfect foil to Peter's Spider-Man, and the structure of this movie perfectly highlights that. While its emotional highs are nowhere close to that of Spider-Man 2, and its action not even hitting the peaks of Spider-Man 2, I think Raimi did such an amazing job for his first outing. When Uncle Ben dies, the whole speech to Peter about great power touches me even now. Frankly, this film also has the best reveal of a villain finding out Peter is Spider-Man in any Spider-Man film. The only two films that I think are able to replicate something on this level is the end of Amazing Spider-Man 2 when Harry finds out Peter's identity, and how Vulture finds out Peter's identity in Spider-Man Homecoming. But that's another topic for another day. Having Norman and Peter fight before a big Thanksgiving dinner, Norman finds out that Peter is Spider-Man due to the most subtle way possible, the wound he had inflicted on him earlier. I must applaud Raimi and co. for such genius thinking. I honestly believe this film is underrated. I see a lot more people talk about Spider-Man 2, and more have come around to Spider-Man 3, but I feel like Spider-Man 1 gets left in the dust, and if it's talked about, it's mainly the memes or Dafoe's phenomenal performance. Spider-Man 1 not only manages to tell a compelling story, but also has a fantastic origin for both its main character that never felt boring. Unlike some movies, Raimi understands what makes Spider-Man and the Green Goblin who they are, and he translates it perfectly on screen. With a few exceptions, such as no web shooters and the whole Power Rangers suit, but I can look past those. While I would have preferred web shooters, it would have sadly taken away the amazing web-swinging origin scene, and I don't want to live in a world where that isn't in at least one Spider-Man film. Anyway, this is where I wrap this video up. Please let me know your thoughts on the first Spider-Man film, or even the other two after it. Were my criticisms of Spider-Man 2 valid? And if you enjoyed anything I had to say, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on that bell. 90% of my audience is not subscribed. It would mean the world to me if you can help me get this channel to 2K before the end of the year. Also, if you want more of me, go follow me on Twitter. And stay tuned for next week, or whenever I decide to upload it, maybe sometime before Christmas, where I talk about the amazing films and why I think The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is not as bad as most people think. Certainly better than the first film. But I have been Grim Toki, this has been Beyond Animation, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.